Thank you, Charles. Thank you everyone for attending our event, Teaching with Cases Impacting the Classroom. And it is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce you to Nadine de Gannes. She's a faculty director of the HP program at Ivey Business School at Western University. She's also an assistant professor in managerial accounting and control and sustainability. And she's also a member of Ivey EDI Advisory Council. She's also a case reader, writer, and teacher. So I'll let her take it from here.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Julie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. I do a great disservice to a very French name, and you'll probably pick up my accent eventually, or possibly not. I'm Trinidadian, so I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I'll give you a little bit of my path because I think it helps to situate the kind of conversation I will be having with you and engaging with you on, just so you can appreciate my biases, my affinities, maybe where you can feel resonance or salience, or where you say that's actually not at all how I might experience it. And so that we can feel what I always hope to feel in sessions like this, which is a plurality of approaches that we could take, a plurality of perspectives that we bring. And so know that the floor is absolutely always open to questions, comments, your requests for me to clarify anything. I will slow down as I go a little bit. I always start a bit faster than I end with, but we don't have a whole lot of time, but I know that I would want this to be useful for you. So the questions, I'll say it again, say it 3 times probably in the first few minutes, are enormously beneficial for us all. So from Trinidad, I came to Canada. I came to Ivey, actually, Western, and then Ivey for my undergraduate in business. It was my first interaction with case studies. And I will say that it wasn't enough for my soul. And we'll get to that in a moment when we define cases in whatever terms you may define it as, and really dig into that a little bit. The story wasn't complete. And I think I now know in hindsight what my soul was missing because of the master's and PhD I then eventually did at the London School of Economics in accounting, but very much in corporate governance and governance of executive compensation specifically. And so my journey with sociological perspectives in accounting research didn't happen until I started my MSc, and very much started with the Ruth Hines paper, on the 1988 paper, for those of you familiar with it. It's like a piece of poetry to me, and I have absolutely all of my students read it. But what it did, or what it provided, was that lens into the past. And that's what I often am fighting for, I think, that maybe nothing quite so aggressive, but I'm certainly always yearning for more sociological, political, economic contextualization for the stories that we tell in our classes, so that our students, any community we engage with, can oscillate between the long and short arcs of time. So that's just where I think I understand myself now. And looking back, there's that business student who appreciated what cases could bring to the classroom, and then a researcher embedded in my later years through my doctoral training that very much situated herself in history. The history of lots of things. I'm always fascinated. Even this morning, as I was looking through the PowerPoint and working on Tweaksted, I thought, oh, sometimes I find cases bury the lead. And I was like, I Googled it because I actually never looked at the words bury the lead. And it's spelled differently. It's L-E-D-E. Yeah, I see it. Yeah, so I went into an immediate Google rabbit hole on the journalistic reasons why we have a very colloquial spelling of the word lead. So I'll leave that to you as your side project, not to do right now, but just, I think, reminding me yet again that curiosity. And I situate cases as sometimes the beginning, or the way we can invite our students into more radical curiosity because of the storytelling approach that we can take to cases. So there's a bit of the kind of philosophy of learning when I talk about cases, but then very much wanting to give you some practical pieces. And so we'll oscillate between some of that, the deeper meaning of the learning approach, because we have to be constant learners in it in order to produce very good cases and to bring them to life in our classrooms. But I try to always bring it back to really simple questions. And you'll see that as a recurring theme throughout our time together. So, expectations for today, like why teach with cases? They're good for a certain set of sort of classroom scenarios. The other one I have for us is what might you write cases on? And I have a very particular set of views. You may not agree with them, but they're ones that I have experienced, particularly through reviewing cases, and where I see really strong cases versus where I see some of those weaker cases. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, how, and so when I first wrote, I like the little truck symbol, it's how you get going. How do you get moving if this is the thing you want to do next? And how do you make it really manageable? How do you get it in bite sizes? And of course, all of that within the spirit of efficacy, right? The idea of impact, the idea that we would engage, that we would light any reader of a case or any participant in a case discussion. How would we get them to light up with that curiosity? So always thinking back through to the impact that you hope to have in your spheres of influence. So those are our expectations that I've set up. Now I asked Julie to set up a couple polling questions because I wanted to get a sense from our audience today, your experiences with cases. Julie, do you have the polling questions ready by chance? We'll just so that we all know where we are. You can go ahead and launch the first one. Okay.
We are
Oh,
missing a few.
I launched both together. Sorry.
That's all right.
Okay.
I'm quite, yeah, no, that's all right. We don't have to keep it as a sort of surprise pack. It also there's a good amount of experiences then with having taught with them. Okay. And then yes, quite a split group actually on having written them, and maybe we'll demystify them a little bit, because I think that they can feel, if our first foray with cases are the 22-page Harvard cases, then you can't imagine how, in addition to writing academic papers, you'd find time to write those. And I think what I would argue is that we should be thinking of cases in, the one. I'm going to close off our polls now. We should be thinking about them in far more manageable bite sizes. And we can talk a little bit. I'm a big fan of the 3-page A case, maybe a 1-page B case, a 1-page C case, thinking about peppering through, because I know that many of you probably have had variable experiences around the levels of preparation for students sometimes in our classrooms. And while we may hold staunchly to trying to get them to read what we would love them to read, I think there's something also to be said for the practicalities of also ensuring that we have really as engaging an experience we can have in the classroom. And I think the multi-part case series helps us to do that and I'll describe a couple of ways I have done that. Same thing with even academic papers. Sometimes I'm just even taking 2-page excerpts and making sure that I can circulate them in the classroom for these thought experiments. And so either between, the quick newspaper article or the excerpt from an academic paper or a very short case, these are some of the ways that we can pepper in these moments to make sure all of our students are on literally the same page, and then engage them in questions. I'm just going to quickly have a answer the chat. Okay, lovely. Okay, so I'm going to use the chat for this, so you can throw in, and so we have a bit of a record of some of your impressions. But if I were to ask you to describe case studies, to think about maybe the characteristics of them, whatever comes to mind when I say if you were to describe to me what a case study is, what might you throw down? Maybe it's a couple words, a phrase, a sentence. Let's take a few moments just to get your juices going. Yes, thank you. Starting us off. Right. These are enjoyable to read. Lots of really, so my next slide is not going to nearly do it justice. I like your no single answer. And that's actually, you can well appreciate it, Michelle. So often our students find themselves deeply dissatisfied with that. And how do we create that as a positive experience? And I often speak to those plurality of perspectives. And another one that I'm doing much more so with case teaching now, just given how much we're talking about our identities, and our students are sometimes much more conversant than us, even in an articulation around that, is spending even the first moments in a case classroom before you even get going to help them to situate. And for ourselves, I think we emulate it, where and I say this is one of my examples, is Trinidadian, you know, having grown up where I looked like everybody else, many of everybody else, majority race is what I would say, right? In my own upbringing, and then didn't find in my first instances for myself that race was particularly salient for me in the way I thought about my identity. I mean, perhaps others are perceiving it of me, but it's not. Gender is what triggers for me very quickly. I'm often very, very sensitive on that front and recognizing it as such. And I share that with students from the perspective of recognizing that my lived experiences and what I can speak from that is going to look different than the systems that we research. Sometimes it's going to map and sometimes it isn't. And when we speak, what position are we speaking from? And so that helps them to situate themselves sometimes when they want to bring, you know, we're not running classes on opinions. Our students are either speaking into a scenario because they have a lived experience or because they've done some sort of research on it. Their comment is backed by. And so to help them appreciate that it doesn't always map, and when it doesn't, how can we use nuance when we're engaging in that case discussion? So I think that's where I took it from the multiple answers. I know that's often at the end of a case, but I think even from the beginning of case teaching to help set a stage in the classroom for the different ways that we voice in a space. And why I also situate that for them, this idea that in being a racialized woman, I'm not thinking of it first. That doesn't mean that I can't appreciate how much it's occurring for others because we understand systems of exclusion or disenfranchisement. And I have a responsibility to articulate through those pieces because I hold a lot of power and influence in my institution. So it's those are now very, very, feel very important to me in a case context, because it allows us to give ourselves and our students another go at sometimes articulating a point they're trying to make, so that when it can sometimes land as these universal truths and really exposes others, the student or yourself, to a misinterpretation or derision, it's that, what do you mean by that is the question that I am asking students to ask, and I'm asking myself to ask before I jump to a conclusion. Because we are talking very often now, and right, the real world, it's listed in here, this idea that we take in real world situations. I think the nuance I often add to that now is, yeah, but from somebody's perspective. And so for, you know, this articulation here around, it's a weaving together of social facts and evidence-based sources. Sure, that's our intention, but there are particular voices that are amplified through that narrative. And it's so now important for us, increasingly so, as we've come to appreciate the ways that we craft knowledge, right? That's what we're taking into the class, this sort of piece of information that is performing on the students as knowledge that they will hold. What are our responsibilities with that? And so thinking through the contextualized story that is a case, not only for what it takes, but what it leaves out. And the very deliberate choices that sometimes we will be making in that, because there is no whole picture, right? There is no fully complete picture. So I think if I'm saying anything about cases in the next iteration of it is, how do we find language around, yes, real world example, incomplete picture, and what is really privileged as parts of the story. And I mean that in a lot of different ways, right? Not just as identity, but geographies, parts of a business, right? These are all different choices being made. And the more that we spend time just even articulating that, saying it out loud, we craft a better product to elicit that conversation. Maybe I'll pause for a second there to see if there are any kind of reactions or questions to that, whether you throw it in the chat or you raise your hand. All okay? Should probably count for like 5 seconds or something like it. Okay. All right. If anything else occurs to you, though, do feel free to, and I'm happy to loop back on it. So there's something, the fourth point I also want to pick up on here is this it's this vehicle for animating our theories and our concepts. And if you've looked at Ivey cases is what I'm most familiar with, you'll know that we don't really actually write in theory or concepts into the case itself. It stays very close to the narrative, the story that's being told, and the information that publishing has, because these are the constraints as much as they're opportunities in publishing, they're constraints to them. And so an Ivey case, because we're the second largest producer of cases, so we do produce quite a bit, but it means that there have been choices made there. And so for you as an educator that's considering what it might mean to capture the very essence of what you work at, what you are raising awareness around, what you may be in close affinity with, if you want that to exist in the world of education through something like a case, then you really are teaching the teachers. And that means that a lot of what you can infuse from your research is in the teaching note. It's not in the case that the students read, but it's in how you prepare, how you're preparing yourself to engage in that class, and how you're preparing anyone else who might also pick up that and purchase that case if you choose to get it through to publication. So that's, I think, making choices around what way do cases become a part of a broader fabric, beyond just, you teaching them, which is beautiful, but others teaching them as well. So, and I speak to that constraint. I mean, if you're making choices around teaching writing a case to take into your classroom without the constraints of publication, then you may make choices to put in a subsection on a particular theory. But that's not what you would see as sort of the typical business school published case. I just want to make that distinction. Maybe we never had to think about it in those terms, but the reality is, for us is, if you're blending, linking your academic research lives to your teaching lives, which is the position that I'm always strongly advocating, because of how little time we all often feel we have, because we do often have little time, then how closely can we connect those worlds? And so I'll speak a little bit more to the teaching note, but that's what I mean at the end in terms of it's a vehicle for animating theories and concepts, but it's not obvious to us in the case text. So I also hear what you have, why do we teach with cases? And I wanted to make the point, I know it came up in the chat a little bit about, focusing them on issues, opportunities. I broadened it out to a few examples. There's something quite typical about cases, it's to elicit a decision. I think what we find ourselves grappling with here as well as how do we also inspire action beyond it? Like where does learning go afterward, and how are we also building the capacity in our students to take the seed planting exercise that is often in our classrooms and make it mean something for the ways that they make choices. And so that's a trickier part of, what happens after the classroom that we are balancing all the time. I mean, a reflection is a very powerful mechanism, and a plurality of, similarly, I use reflection quite a bit on the cases that are meatier and have these very, very difficult implications. And so I think a question for us when you think about impact is, sure, we may get to a decision, a recommendation, but that has to not be enough for us. When we think about mobilizing an action, that endpoint in the class can't be all there is. And so when you think about your course structure as a slightly longer arc of time, how are you also articulating for your students that they're not always getting 3 key takeaways at the end of a case class? That it's not always quite so. I mean, I think we need to give students some of that because of the age and stage of life they're at. If you're teaching in an undergraduate cohort, I even find that still with my executive MBAs, they want something a little bit concrete sometimes, which gives them sufficient safety to really launch into the very murky territory I'm taking them into when I am impressing upon them that measurement is limited and that we have, lots of challenges as it relates to what we account for and what is left unaccounted for. So in your design, yes, we might be talking about teaching cases, but one case has to sit within an ecosystem of learning. So how is it you're thinking about the ways that you intensify over time into more obscurity? And how you enable some of that reflection, and I wouldn't say I'm there yet in terms of thinking about the action part. We're trying to do more and more of that, especially in our EDI curriculum, right, at Ivey, because we're a business school and there's all of this sort of tensions around the role we play in the very damaging practices that we see proliferate in corporate Canada and elsewhere. And then the last little one, the fun, it's memorable. Stories are memorable, and taking them from the parts of your research and life, especially when you're the author of those cases, it gives it something special and something different. And we'll talk a little bit about how you might craft that. Another kind of something at the back of your mind, in this little laundry list of things to ask yourself or think through. Great cases are complex. And I contrast that perhaps to complicated. So sometimes in accounting, we might imagine, just the numbers are not going to make for a great case. Sure, okay. We might embed the calculation part within it, but really where we can make learning sing is in the implications, right? So sure, you get to break even, and I just taught a case like this very recently. A coffee shop didn't break even. And the students now are asking themselves, well, what do I do to break even? Well, we have one of 2 levers. We either increase revenue or we decrease costs. That's how they're thinking that through their 2 levers. I said, okay, well, now implications of decreasing costs. What would you do? I'll cut one of my baristas. Okay. And how are you going to do that? Because I think so often the conversation stops there. That's a decision, right? You have to cut this laborer. And this is where the whole world then opens to me to talk about the implications of that, like how comfortable our society has become with words like redundant and reorg and reduction, when it completely masks the implication for that person who's just gone home. that the trajectory of the earnings for the rest of their life has been likely upended, that they will have different health outcomes, worse health outcomes, that there is a higher rate of divorce for those who have been made redundant. Like, we then have this world that we can step into that launches off out of that simple sentence, well, I'll just cut a laborer. And that's where, because this is the beauty I've always thought of us being in accounting, is that numbers feel simple and clean and clear until you start peeling the layers of what seems like a very straightforward choice. And that's where cases, that's when that kind of complexity I get most excited about in the classroom, because you can take them down these pathways, so that the most satisfying thing we get as instructors in a moment like that is, oh, I never thought about that. Oh, you gave me a lot to think about. And that is one of my big measures of success in a conversation with students in a moment like that. Then I think as I was poring over that example this morning, I thought to myself, well, what would be the action? Because if we're building capacity in them, and they are the person who takes on the payroll job or the HR job that makes that decision, how are they then using that knowledge to make others aware of what they've just come to know? And so this is the piece that is really at stake for us, because how do we then take them into the role playing or the practice of what would you ask any HR manager to have thought through in the process of actually going ahead with that redundancy, if they have the ability to make a different choice. But if it is indeed going ahead, what else can be done? Because awareness, at least, is the first instance. And if that's the role that even our students will play in their first junior roles, at least we're getting them to think about who they might speak to, how they might articulate the concern, how they could be active agents of change. So the beauty then of cases is all of these junctures, all of these moments that you could come to then ask that question. Well, what about this? Have you thought about that? And that's where I said a little bit earlier in the session that I'm really feeling good about short cases and multiple parts, because if you're just asking them to read the sort of foundation, first 3 pages, right? And they come to class with that, then you can open up the discussion for those first 20 minutes. And then if you give them the case B, you slide it out electronically, is what I do for those. Drop them electronically on their learning management page. I just kind of always have it queued ready to release it, or it could be a timed release if you're very comfortable with all of the different ways that your learning management systems can aid you in the classroom. And then what? Give the students 3 minutes to read a page, if it's something that then will give them the next set of discussion, or it might be that you give them that case B and then they break out into little buzz groups or into breakouts. Made even easier for some of you when you're teaching online, because you can just sort of pop open a breakout room. So that's where I'm thinking these kinds of moments we create, where you know that everybody in the room has the information, then you can think in novel ways to break up the learning objectives you may have. So I'm going to pause for breath and any kinds of questions you might have. But I thought in this as well, and we'll have an activity in just a moment. I did, when I returned to Ivey, so I'll share that, about 5 years ago, after my PhD, I started here directly as a junior faculty member. And, oh, thanks so much for the note. And one thing I was encouraged to do was write my teaching philosophy. And so I'll share that really right after my undergrad, I had taught in our pre-business program, like fresh out of school, deeply insecure. I was deeply insecure 10 years later for a different set of reasons, but really fresh out of and teaching in our like second year accounting course. And at that time, I almost can cringe at it, but my teaching feedback at that point would have been, funny. Like I probably was cracking jokes then. I crack far fewer jokes now, which I consider to be a sign of my growth and comfort with self. But for me, crack jokes if that's what you do in your lives, by all means. But for me, I wanted to be a different educator when I came back after my PhD. And so when I wrote my teaching philosophy document, I wrote that I wanted to be relevant. And I wasn't quite perfectly clear on what that was going to look like. But there were maybe several meanings embedded within that, for relevant for what they may have needed, relevant for what we need in our society, our economy, and I wanted to be able to bring my research into the classroom. And what I came to understand over the X number of years of study. And I did that in little ways. So this is the first thing I'll describe about how we may get onto a runway for case writing. I didn't start immediately. What I did was I took in the newspaper article, the one pager. It wasn't my own case initially, but even after I had maybe taught what our curriculum was set up to do, I was always creating these 20 minutes or 15 minutes in which I could bring that something else, the thought experiment, that we all have this little adventure to try to see what they'd make of it. And when I got to teaching the balanced scorecard, as was in the managerial accounting course I was assigned, I thought, balanced scorecard is, it has so many parallels. And for me, in executive compensation research, it had the parallel to the executive performance scorecard. And so I had done fieldwork during my PhD at an executive pay consultancy in the UK. And I had called up one of the consultants I had worked with in that time and said, are there any really interesting scorecards that you know of? And she suggested one, and I just took that into the classroom. After I'd kind of taught the lesson, and there was a case associated with it, but it was that first year, all I took into the class was, I think, the pay performance scorecard for Barrick's president and chairman. And just sort of seeing their reactions. In the next year, I know I'm fortunate here because our students do case writing courses, but to the extent that you have students who can do case writing courses or these kinds of research style courses in your programs, that they could feed, be very, very productive contributors to your case writing endeavors. I had signed on one of my students to do that. And we worked on the first draft of the Barrick Gold case, which I very much crafted as an executive compensation, ESG integration case. And didn't actually teach it as a case in the first instance. In my second year, we assigned it as the group project. And it was from the student groups and all of their reports that they generated. It was so generative for my own thinking that we then crafted or sort of recrafted the teaching note, because we recognized how the students responded to that first draft of the case, and then changed it again and made some changes. And then finally it was published, 3 years after I started, 3 or 4. So it's not, that's to say, you can do these little things along the way to test things out before you make that bigger commitment to really writing a 10-page case with all of its exhibits and a publication process, for example. But I've always loved what it means to take it in as a group project, because you really do get to see that first testing of a case before you try to teach it. And how we really do think about the multiple ways that we live our lives. And that'll come to in the exercise shortly. The last one, I was just recognizing that some institutions are really pushing for the cases because they're considered experiential, and we know if you're, at least in the context of Ontario or Canada generally, the measurement for higher education, this big emphasis on experiential, and cases being one kind of experiential learning. So depending on the mechanisms, the incentives, the strategic priorities of your institutions, this might be very, very, very relevant right now. And you're just trying to navigate, well, how do I really do this on top of everything else that I have to do? So, and just sort of recognizing the many asks of us. So this is the activity, whether you have, have a little remarkable piece of paper and a pencil. I'm going to take a moment to describe this. I did a little bit of it just now with Beric, but maybe spend a couple moments linking to the purple circle, the practice circle, and then you're going to try this for you as well. So I'll take a sip of water before we go. So this is the belief, and from my experiences with cases, reviewing them, writing them, teaching them. With the time that we have in a day, I believe, I feel confident in doing ourselves the great service of keeping our worlds as tightly connected if it is we're going to take on case writing. And there are a few reasons for that. It makes for better cases if it is that we hold expertise in the area that we're writing on. I can appreciate an avid reader of news, mostly geopolitical news. And we can read something that we feel very, very strongly about, and we think to ourselves, right, this is what I'm going to write a case about. I'm going to take it and make sure that this is a case that exists for anybody to purchase just as well or use in their classrooms. And that passion alone won't make for a strong case. We have to either find a co-author, a case writer to help complement it, but situating that passion into a sphere of expertise is incredibly important, because there are responsibility in how we teach the teachers that would take on a case, for example. It's how we are able to take that, that real life example, that moment in a company's or nonprofits or governmental agencies, that moment, that empirical example, and situate it. So it's the contextualizing already the context, contextualized story, a deeper set of contextualization, the generalizability, perhaps, the transferability of the lesson. And that is what our research can really do for the empirical story that we hope to take into the classroom. So I think it's been de-emphasized for too long, the role that our research can play in case writing and how it can really meaningfully show up in the teaching note as a way that maybe it's already an intermediary step as you're distilling it for a newspaper article or a very short brief, whatever different outlets you're already producing for. This could be the intermediary draft on the journey to something quite pithy, but it makes a world of difference in terms of what we can do in the classroom to situate the lessons, and also to equip our students, because we can appreciate if we're looking at the data across the board, there's such a loss of trust in so many of our institutions. The capacity we're working to build in our students is how can they tell good data from data generally, right? And so we play that role as well with case teaching. We have a role to play in situating these empirical examples in good data, rigorous research findings, so that our students also understand how to do that. So then the journey into practice is one of two or three things. What might it mean practically for our students? And I take us back to that example of the layoffs. If they're playing any role in which they could raise their voice in helping an organization to appreciate there is good data that would help us to understand the impact on those made redundant in an organization, those laid off, how could we do better in that process? Because we know during the pandemic, we saw any number of like very upsetting stories about people who were laid off over a Zoom call or something. I mean, I understand that, but where they couldn't be in person, but if it was a mass Zoom call, unacceptable. And it's understanding how do we have those kinds of conversations about what we might consider to be unacceptable and how we would do differently. So there's practical implications for students. There could be practical implications if our research is also really closely engaged with a practitioner community. Then same thing with the Barrett Gold case, that became a conversation I was having with pay consultants in Canada. I had done my research in the UK, but now I was looking at a Canadian company. I started establishing relationships with pay consultants and governance consultants in the context of Canada. So you're looking for that sweet spot at the intersection of these three. And it means two things. It means squaring away the duplication of things. We should never be creating a case that already exists out there. There's just no reason to do that. We should just be using a case that fits, with research and practice in our teaching. And because that would just be a waste of our resources, right? We have to be finding that spot in the teaching where it just doesn't exist. So at the very middle of, it's not in our teaching, no one has that resource available. It's definitely within the sphere of our research, and we care about these practical implications, which really deepens our understanding of the impact. This is the triad. So with all of that I've just said, I want you to take an opportunity now, draw these 3 circles, jot down at least within the parts you really understand about yourself and your work, what might occur in any of those circles. I want to give us a few minutes to do that, about 3-4 minutes. Is that a reasonable amount of time? And then maybe we'll have a brave soul share a little bit about what they've, and if nobody else is, then Julie, you'll be on call for describing your 3 circles. I'm just repeating the question for anyone who's just joined as well, that you're taking a moment to jot down for yourself in these 3 circles where your research, what you're teaching, and maybe where you're seeking to have practical impact. We're looking for that sweet spot where they might interconnect so that this is the productive space in which you would want to be writing a case. Good. Hopefully a few minutes to get at least the beginning going. I'll quickly, I say quickly, I don't know that I do anything very quickly. The question about teaching notes available, I mean, yes and no. Yeah, so students get their hands on, let's say, past notes, and perhaps if they're, yes, there's even the bad behavior of the actual teaching note becoming available. So we have to think in the context of priorities around, and I do appreciate that this is more of a dialogue, because I understand that I can have sometimes moralistic positions on things. The idea that they'll get the numbers, fine. I'm actually okay with that part. I'll speak to them why they do themselves a disservice in not actually figuring out the calculation. But in fact, no two case classes should ever feel the same, ever. And I experienced that. Part of how we understand our own growth as case teachers is that we don't really feel duplication. Yes, fine, the number calculation may be, but where we are able to take the conversation is a function of the students we have in that classroom and the ability to take us down some different pathways. And that can very much be the case through implications. So we change our styles. We can adapt our style a little bit to take from a student who maybe like very easily throws out what we might consider to be that first line of recommendation, which is where the teaching note will list, in bullet points. But how do we then return to that student, take them down that path? So I will say, we're changing how we're onboarding our students this year, because and we've grown, and I'll say that, right? Like many, I think, academic institutions may have felt some degrees of growth. We intake 770 students now in the undergraduate program. And my goal this year is to not let them start classes immediately, but to work with them over those first weeks around expectations that they're participating in, so that the accountability mechanism isn't just us as an administrative office telling them that we expect them to behave better. Because if we really want, so I'm going to give the philosophical answers to how I'm trying to grapple with this thing of this passing notes around, and how we impress upon them the great disservice they do to their own learning, when so many are on the mind trajectory of like, I just need to get this job, is what we hear far too often. And so rather for them to appreciate, and I still romanticize higher education, and I'm honest about that this is a place that we will debate things, and we will care deeply, and we will treat each other with dignity and respect, and I hold fiercely to it. So we need to onboard them in a way that we talk through, and we're going to help stage at least their first learning team. So our students are organized into learning teams, and this all supports case learning, so that they read a case individually, and you'll see these models in just a moment. I'll go through them. I'm speaking to this point of onboarding because I think it'll make a difference in how they're engaging with ChatGPT, or because they're going to use it, and I would expect them to. But how do we want them to do so with integrity and with an enhancing of their education? So what I want to create for them as a possibility is what a really outstanding case classroom experience looks like when they've prepared, when they've met their learning team, and they've taken themselves to the next level, and then they come to the classroom and we deliver an outstanding experience of what it means to engage students who have prepared. And this is the vision is that if they can appreciate, by us having somewhat more very deliberately curated that first instantiation of a case classroom, that they can understand every time we deviate from that, it is a combination of things. It'll be a combination of a lack of preparedness individually or in their learning teams before they walk in. And so if we're setting up a very clear picture of the expectations, that is what we're hoping, and helping them to participate in the conversations around how they bring themselves to that classroom. And what do they hope to see? These are conversations that are missing, I think, in our onboarding and business education. So that whole week, 3 intensive days of equity, not only, but equity practice, it's articulation and it's practice. And all of these are ways that they're showing up in the room, because it's a multifaceted problem. The idea that we can just take shortcuts without actually having a conversation about how it damages the entire room. And so I say the same thing, it's not like there's the death of meritocracy. It's not that at all. What we have going on is increasing visibility of all of the different ways that people show up as exceptional. And so let's have conversations about what this exceptional is and what it looks like for us as a community, because then it engages in some of those. And then when they do deviate from this, we have a lot of mechanisms where we're detecting, then we come at it with restorative justice. So we're also quite clear that that's the first instantiation of how we're going to deal with it. A punitive is much further down the line. But I think we're not having conversations about the whole arc of it to then tackle this moment of it. Because this moment of, I'll just pull on the last year's notes, is part of a bigger fabric of responsibility or lack thereof. And if we're hoping for them to show up for the climate and anything else, it's like all of the little ways that we lie along the way become bigger ways that we lie to ourselves. So that's, hopefully a blend of, there's some practical issues there, but maybe if we discount how much that's the issue and think about all of the other structural pieces that we have to put in place if we want them to even understand their accountability in this. I'm happy to also have a conversation offline about it. I know this is, but that's where I'm at, and really, really spending a lot of time thinking deeply on what do we do, right? Because I felt deeply dissatisfied with it. I think the bigger torture is for my students to have to sit down and for 45 minutes and tell me why they made the choices they've made, than just the 5% deduction or 10% deduction that comes. So to the 3-part circle, anybody willing to share some of what came out for them as they sort of played in this space, the sandbox, if you will, of your lives?
You want me to say mine as an icebreaker?
Yeah. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So for research, I put in sustainable finance and responsible investment. I put big keywords. I usually teach things at the intersection of management and sustainability. And I guess that practice was probably the hardest for me. So I put understanding the junction of businesses, markets, and sustainability.
And who do you want to understand that? Is it that the students need to come to that? Or is it that you're hoping for a different, community member?
Can it be both?
Right. And that's the kind of level of granularity we get to, right? When we think, thank you for starters for sharing. It's and this is the next thing I'll say just as well, like with case writing, we'd have to keep exposing our ideas as much as possible at early stages, because it gets us sort of really crystal clear much sooner on narrative writing, right? Because it's going to be different than academic writing a little bit, unless we write our papers in that Ruth Hines 1988 style. Then I think for us, it's going to be a slight deviation from academic writing to narrative writing. But thanks, Julie, because practical, it's going to look differently for different ones of us, depending on the ways that we show up for advocacy work in the issues we care about. But then we might be asking ourselves, where are we building that capacity, in whom? And it may well even just be colleagues, right? If we want, that's why I said a little earlier with institutional rationales, it may be that you're trying to build bridges with other departments or area groups within your institution. And these might even serve some practical purposes where you can work in collaboration with others. So Any others thinking through, maybe even have a question like this, you're stumped on any one, well, you're probably less likely stumped on all, but questions, comments, thoughts? Okay. All right. And just as well, if you think of anything else, feel free to stop me and I'll pop back to it. So the next little bit is really taking you into the space of to teach, to write, but to also be the student. I guess I think in threes often enough, but the next stage is that if you're going to engage in case writing, and just as well we do it in, I don't know the extent to which you do it in case teaching, but I have a rule with my case teaching, and it's that I never read the teaching note first. I read the case first, and I do the case as a student would. Because if we don't have the lens of the case through their eyes, how could we anticipate and truly sit with that sort of uncertainty for ourselves? And I know, and I can appreciate that there are time constraints on this, but if efficacy in case teaching is a goal for you, then taking an approach like that makes a difference. And I keep it up. Doesn't matter. I've taught my own case. I have to read it as a student would. And fine, I get faster at it over a number of years if I've done, taught a case 10, 12 times, but I've not deviated from that commitment to the process of preparation being as a learner, and then going to the teaching note for the purposes of setting up my classroom. Because, and I'm a person, I get very actually irritated by repetition. And so I just can't have the same thing happen every year. I change subtle things or sometimes drastic things. I change the reflection questions or the assignment or the length of it or the focus of it. I've gotten to a stage now with my executive MBAs that I quite like, which is I ask them to do their scorecard. So I've really made it quite personal. We go through this journey of understanding how do you even set up executive compensation contracts, and how would we get ESG metrics in there? But then because I don't have examples of scorecards of their lives, and so their personal assignment, because of the stage of life they're in, is that they do quite well in trying to take a crack at writing up their own scorecard and thinking about the kinds of ESG metrics that they might pull in. So my prompt to you is, as you think about coming at writing, how can you see through these multiple lenses? I'm going to have a read of this question. Okay, so the question here, and maybe I might ask you to clarify a little bit for me, Michelle, we're drawing what about research on pedagogy? What role does it play in case development? And so this is where there'll be some resources, and I think one you're teaching at your center depends on the development of your Center for Teaching and Learning, the extent to which they may have those resources in. Like for Ivey Publishing, I do workshops for them, and so we would be pulling on different pedagogies around even question design of assignment questions. So we just have the hour and a half to give you this sort of bigger arc. But when I go into the granularity of case teaching, I do walk through, even with participants, like questions. Is this a good question? In what way are we pulling on like Bloom's taxonomy? Should I be starting with a create question? Absolutely not. It should be an intensification over time. Identify first, analyze second. And that becomes a little bit clearer when you appreciate this arc, right? That we're expecting individual preparation. So there is content out there. I think probably a different kind of workshop, or I will give some thought to maybe what resources are quite pithy and easy enough to grasp quickly, so that you'll feel, because I get it, we're in a researching mind, you're like, well, what are the different pedagogical parameters you want to operate within? And they exist. But I hadn't thought of it in terms of, because I teach it, I don't think of it in terms of reading it, but I will give that some more thought. Because really here in the design of, you're very welcome, in the design of thinking through, this is two hats on, right? you're thinking about how the student is coming to the case by themselves in the first instance. And this is the case that you're writing, right? Recognizing that the next instance for them is the small group discussion, if you break them off into learning teams. And sometimes we want that to be done in advance of the class. Sometimes it might happen in the class. And so this same intensification of the question asking, which shapes the design of the information or content you include in your cases before they get in the last instance to what's incrementally provided in the large classroom space, the space that will feel, very different. Now, some of I don't know if your libraries or your institutions may be picking up on different kinds of technology, but I know that one of the applications that a faculty member brought to our attention here was Perusal. And so the PDF of the case was uploaded and students could have highlighted and commented, and then another one of their group members could have responded. I know we have discussion boards, but I can appreciate as well the volume of feeling like you have to monitor those can feel very overwhelming. And so if it is that you're using something like Perusal, the students themselves have a responsibility to manage that, and you have a much more cursory glance at what it is that's happening there, but not actually trying to read to respond. You're trying to appreciate that they are engaging in the spirit of what was assigned to them. So there is a bit of that happening, that you may ask them something, the light analytical questions before they come into the classroom discussion, where you're really hoping to dig into the very meaty implications of whatever analysis has been done. And that I can appreciate happens at later stages in the case when we're more advanced. So that's to give us, just some ways of thinking through visualization. I wanted to take us to the general arc of the case writing process that we would suggest to Ivey Publishing, appreciating as well that this is just one way of doing it. And so what I wanted to leave with you as a tool, the next sort of 3-slide exercise is on the opening paragraph in particular. I want to demystify how quickly or what you might think to be a very slow process and try to make it a little quicker to start. And so if it is you're going to take a crack at the case, and so I'll go back to one more, we're going to focus on the opening paragraph. For those, many of you have taught with cases, so you can appreciate something of this flow. It doesn't have to be perfectly in this order. Of course, the only thing that I would argue is unchanged is that the opening paragraph is at the beginning and the conclusion at the end. And so it is the opening paragraph that I want to spend a little time on with you as your sort of first foray into thinking about what you might take on as a case. And even if your decision is not to write a case, maybe even in just identifying what's most important to you from an opening paragraph, you're better able to start identifying cases that you might bring into your curriculum. So I think a really fruitful activity always before launching into case writing is to figure out what you might put in. So I'm going to give us an example of an opening paragraph to read. So with those 2 paragraphs, right, and we see them often enough when we start reading any case, I want us to be systematic about, at least in your first draft, thinking about what should be in there. And so this is the list, right? And I think you captured a lot of it earlier when we did a dump on like what's happening in cases, the kind of issue, a decision, something that they have to solve. So again, with those sort of really like the simple high level questions, who are we, right? We're taking on a role. And sometimes I ask the students to be themselves in that role, and they can bring all of their own complex and intersecting positionalities, or or we're asking them to take on what is provided to us of that protagonist. I don't know that we often make that distinction enough. And maybe that's one to play with a little bit to decide, what am I really asking of a student? Do they get to speak with their own voice, or are they being asked to assume that history of that protagonist in this case? And maybe if you're not so detailed, at least you've had that conversation with yourself as to why. So I would expect, and maybe at a later stage of your case, you make choices about shifting any of these questions out of that opening paragraph. But I would say good practice, at least in the first instance, is that you have it. You have your who, right? You have the what. What is the problem or opportunity here? You have something of the where, right? And we take this one for granted often, and we'll go back to the opening paragraph in just a moment and look through it again, thinking through the who, the what, the where, when. Time dimensions, temporal dimensions are so important because we can't have any information past that point. It's actually the upside of ChatGPT. We're timing out right now, 2021. You can assign any collapse of anything from this year, and they're less likely to be helped. And then the last one, I think, has been less talked about in cases, but I very much believe if you're bringing your research lens into the pedagogy of cases, case writing and teaching, then that's social phenomenon at stake. Why are we attentive to this problem? Why are we attentive to this opportunity? What does it mean on a much grander scale than just this one story? I remember so often during my PhD, Mike would ask me, Mike Powell's my supervisor, and he'd be like, well, why is this important to anybody? All the time. Who cares about pay consultants, Nadine? And why would they care about it in XYZ places? And it was one of those really early, important kind of frameworks to which I was always thinking, yeah, so what, right? And we do it all the time for research. How do we bring that here into the way we think about cases being situated into that bigger social context? So let's revisit the same paragraph and asking yourself, do I see who? Do I see what? Do I see where? When? And why? And you could drop it in the chat. What's missing? Maybe you don't think anything's missing. Do we have a where? No, exactly. We take for granted, I think, this is a case written by, Canadian academics in the context of Canada. And so just assumed everybody would know Maple Leaf Foods was in Canada. And so that's why it's the checklists do help, because it pushes us to ask ourselves, if we had a different audience, would it be so automatic to them? Would it be so obvious? Is the what clear enough? Does, and maybe it becomes more granular later. Sometimes the case author will use the concluding paragraph to really break them down. But if it is that you want some sort of hook in for your reader, then you you can make, you have, this is where exposing it, right? I mean, you think we have a group of 30 something people, 35, it is an opportunity to, and that's why it's nice to take it to your colleagues. Is this question clear? So many of us know we've rewritten research questions and haven't done so without eyes on it. The case is the same thing. Yeah, impact of the food system. Yeah, true. Yeah, agreed. And the phenomenon, and I know, and I can appreciate that when we're deeply steeped in the work of perhaps sustainability, if that's for many of you, social issues, we're so close to it and we can feel so passionately about it that we can't often imagine worlds in which people feel untouched by those issues. And yet we are going to have in our classroom students who will operate untouched by what seems to be some of the most pressing problems. Yeah, yes, you're very welcome, Stacey. So this is where, you know, you can crack into that first sort of sets of questions if it is you want to get to your own, you know, your own start. And so I think sources, have always thought the classroom was a source of inspiration for my research, for writing, for thinking about ideas. Reading, of course, is another phenomenal source. I enjoyed that little Sam Altman tweet there. I know it's a topic for a lot of us. So I thought giving you again, well, I don't want you to, I know you're a little quieter, but thinking, of course, away, but I wanted to leave you with, I love leaving homework. I think of it like a party bag, a little present for everybody, but that you can give this a go, you know, trying out your opening paragraph as soon as you just have 5 minutes just to jot things down, like a dream journal, you know, and think about what you might put there, no different than the 3 circles. I did want to take us back once more to the conversation about the teaching note, and then allow for any questions you might have. And, you know, I'm terrible with PowerPoint. I animate them and then I just put everything all up at once. I'll talk through it. And I rewrote this one this morning, actually, because I'm often can be quite practical sometimes in the teaching workshops I do. But I truly believe that when we think about cases and I think of a community like this one, if you're writing cases or even little short exercises, how might that be shared within this community so that more of you can be teaching, more of you can feel informed in that approach to teaching a topic that may feel like it's sitting somewhat outside of your direct range of interest. And so your teaching note becomes that really excellent way to bring other members of the community into a set of knowledge they might not have. Quality control. And so this is my experience as a reviewer. I will sometimes read a case, and then I will read the teaching note and see questions and see analysis that there's just not nearly enough data in the case to support that. And that can happen because that's if we're doing, the teaching note afterward and we have all of the full information and we have, the what happened, that gets carried away in the teaching note and not sufficiently written into the case. And so you're meant to produce them both at the same time. Because that's that same thing, right? Thinking through as a student experience, a participant's experience, just as well as the instructions for how to actually solve it. And that the bullet point about ensuring completeness is very much an Ivey publishing kind of piece. They don't publish cases without teaching notes, so we have that kind of little extra. But to be fair about social issues is that I'm seeing so much really, really good content in helping to give instructors confidence about how to come to a classroom in which they might be very worried. And I've had any number of conversations with faculty over the last couple of years that I've been in the sort of more administrative role. You teach a De Beers case and you're going to get a student who's going to talk about social issues, oil and gas, and you're going to have it happen. How do we do it in a way that we keep our students in the conversation? Because we're getting a different set of comments now that from, let's say, our conservative leaning students, that there is no world in which they can voice their views in the classroom. And to me, that that's a real concern, because silence and echo chambers is not impact. It is, and if we're not creating the spaces in which we can hear it and in which we can engage it, and I won't say that all topics we are there yet in our student community, in our classroom spaces, but we are trying to take the steps to get there. And so that's part of why the onboarding has now become so critically important, because cases are, as you've shared, like they're somebody's real story. And because they have those elements of reality, they have that emotional reaction. It's why they're memorable. So that's what I wanted to, at least at a high level, try to give you some beliefs about the teaching and learning pedagogies around cases and how you might come to it, but also some practical pieces, hopefully, that help you to crack in. So with that, I know we don't have too long again. I would love to give you an opportunity to ask questions a little more tailored to your particular needs right now as it relates to teaching. And I'll do my level best to respond.
Nadine, I think there's a question in the chat for Michelle.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. And I will say that in my first case, I didn't do it nearly as much as I would now. I saw it done really well, I thought. And it's a Harvard case on, it's a BlackRock case, linking purpose to profit. There were bullet points on high level case insights that I found to be highly digestible. And so if you're looking for an example of one, that's one I liked. Another thing that it prompted me to do just as well, because there's so much research in that space of like CSR and ESG, was also to try to help students to frame magnitude. And the only place I've seen this done is a McKinsey report, where they show the percentage of reports that say that there will be negative returns versus positive returns. Because I think it's so easy in our classrooms for someone to say, well, I read this thing. And so the thing I've gotten clearer about doing for myself in my teaching is magnitude. So just as well, yes, you may have a data-informed point, but if it's negated by, 55 times that much in research findings, you don't actually, how does that point hold water? And I think we probably have a responsibility, not probably, we do have a responsibility, I think, as researchers in the classroom, to help our students to understand how to consider whether that one thing they picked up out of, a very particular agenda, sometimes in reporting, how it stacks up in terms of magnitude of all research being done. So I think that that's another challenge I put forward around how we think about what we put in our teaching notes. Oh yeah, but live cases, very much so. Thank you very much, Elaine, for sharing this. So other options you have around live cases and to bring in the I find alumni to be so generous. I'm hoping that you'll have, I think sometimes the hardest thing is just to ask. But I would encourage you absolutely. And this point is quite nice about what's happening for them live. Really well. Right. I'll say about the different kinds of cases we can write. There are three. There would be the interview base, where you'd have to get a release from the company. You could still disguise that company so that it would be the degrees to which they're comfortable. Then there's what we call an armchair case, or publicly sourced. I would say for Berwick, I published it as a public sources case. I had interviews, but they weren't, they informed how I approached the case and they informed the teaching note, but I didn't quote anybody to the extent that I would have needed a corporate release and to go through legal. So I will say that then if it is, you can establish that the thing you're doing is entirely public sources, you can also publish in that way. The one you're describing, Elaine, or maybe a deviation from this is if you all have experiences through, let's say, consulting or advocacy work or policy work, then you can also write one on the basis of your own experience and create a protagonist. If they're short, I mean, and students are kind of not always necessarily needing to be hopped up on large companies and those protagonists, then I think that there's a lot of richness there. And we have a number of cost accounting cases like that. Like I love Midwest office products as an ABC case from Harvard, and that was just 10 years of consulting experience written up, and our ability to like really deepen into same thing. What would it mean to lay off 16 employees as that costing model? That doesn't exist in the teaching note from a case first written in the 90s, but because we weren't having those conversations. But how could you start bringing those kinds of points in? Yeah, so thanks for sharing. And this is a nice spot. If anyone else thinks of would like to share other experiments that you've tried in the classroom. I assign every single student I've ever taught the Heinz paper. And I'll stop sharing and see if I can find the example of one of the students who took on the reflection in an art-based in the couple of minutes I have, because it was one of a really, really special reflection. And then, yeah, happy for any other last final questions before we wrap up. Yeah. Seeing your question there, Julie. I don't believe you should write if there's one. If one exists, if it serves the purposes of your classroom, and you can therefore you can bring your research to it because it already lives somewhere, then why write? But if there's a rationale from your institution, they want to make, because some parts of it I've heard rationales around making them just more affordable. So if you're in a developing country, emerging regions where the costs of using published cases are prohibitively high, then absolutely find ways to produce content that are accessible to your students so that they can engage in the ways that you would hope them to. But if the cost is not the barrier, and as it may not be in some places, then use what's there and do something about informing it in those other circles, right? Thinking about your research and thinking about the practical implications. But I am sensitive to the point around, I mean, at least with Ivey Publishing, we have a 39 countries initiative where there are countries that we don't charge for cases. And so if you find that you're checking through our website, if you're in a country that is exempt in that way, then perfect. But maybe this is another forum that we think about if there's going to be case production, how, because I'm all about, in what ways can we do things without cost, right? That's sometimes an individual service logic for some of us, and sometimes it's an institutional service logic. Yeah. Okay. Well, I am very happy for you to send me any individual questions. Maybe what I will do, and I'll get that reflection sent around a little later to the group. So my email is make sure I typed it accurately. I'll put in the chat should you have any questions and you want to follow up later. But just as well, I'll look to send out, and if you haven't read Heinz 1988, then that is also additional homework. But I'll look for that reflection that I found to be another special way in which we can engage our students in the ways that are special to them. So that one was art-based in her reflection. Okay, thanks for your attention. The reference, I mean, which one? Heinz 88, Ruth Heinz. That's the best I'm going to do in communicating reality reconstruction. That one. Yeah. Lovely. Yeah, you're very, very welcome, Lona. Okay. Alrighty. Well, then that's a wrap for us. Julie, Charles.
Yes, thank you. Julie, did you have some final words? I want to wrap up and introduce the next event.
You go.
Okay. Well, Nadine, it's been fascinating. I learned a lot too. I also kind of teach with cases, not at like Ivy, but I think hopefully all the participants here have learned from you. It's great. Thank you for your sharing your insights. I'd like to also and thank you, Julie, for organizing the event, of course, coordinating all that. We are having an event actually pretty soon. We will announce it probably next couple of days. I'll put the announcement in the chat. This is going to be a bit different than from teaching, but also in the context of Accounting for Impact, about academics engaging with NGO organizations and grassroots. And we'll have 3 speakers. Among them, we'll have Julie, but also other speakers as you see in the chat. So you'll hear from that very soon. It's going to be on June 21st online, and you'll be receiving invitation and the link relatively shortly. So again, thank you for your contribution to Accounting for Impact. We are here to, of course, make positive impact in terms of research in different forms, teaching, policymaking, engagement. And we hope to see you at our next events. So again, thank you again, and we wish you a wonderful day, afternoon, and evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.